Hello, I'm Paul Louis Metzger, and I am a professor of theology and culture at Multnomah University and Seminary, and I also direct the Institute for Cultural Engagement, New Wine, New Wineskins. I'm here with my colleague at New Wine, New Wineskins at Multnomah University and Seminary, Derrick Peterson. Why don't you say hi, Derrick?
Hey, everybody.
And Derrick is someone who not only works with me at New Wine, but is a great up-and-coming theologian, blossoming theologian, and historical theologian, and we get to riff on Trinitarian theology and theology of culture on a daily basis, which is a real joy to me, and Derrick puts up with me. So I just want to welcome you to New Wine Tastings. And today we're going to be talking about Professor Colin Gunton and his theology and placing it in the context of Trinitarian theology generally. I worked with Professor Gunton for my doctoral studies at King's College London, and I worked on the subject area of Karl Barth and theology of culture with Professor Gunton. So I have great admiration for Professor Gunton, the late Professor Gunton, and Derrick has done a lot of reading in Gunton, and then across the board in terms of Trinitarian thought. So would you like to say something else, Derrick, before we get into it?
From what you tell me, it was quite the time at King's College. There's a bunch of big names there, right? Gunton, Torrance, Zulus.
And it was really the community of scholarship. It was really communal. It was like what Zulus would call being is communion. It was like scholarship is communion. Focused on Trinitarian thought. And, you know, it's not what Dan Brown would have put forth in terms of his book, The Da Vinci Code, because he talks about the research seminar and systematic theology, and it's like the greatest database in the world for religion. I think, no, that's not what it was. It was a table with a bunch of chairs in a room that people came together to just really reflect rigorously on Trinitarian thought and what it means for the church and culture at large.
There you have it, the one thing Dan Brown got wrong.
Well, we won't go there today. But that being said, today what we really like to talk about is the subject of Trinitarian theology, Gunton's place within it, and we're going to deal with it from three different aspects. First, the three waves of Trinitarian theology. And Derrick has done a phenomenal article for the journal I had at Cultural Encounters on the three waves. He'll just briefly speak to that. And we might pick up on this in future New Wine Tasting talks. And then also the genetic problem as it relates to Gunton in more of the third wave discourse, critiquing Gunton because they see that he didn't get some of the historical figures right in their estimation, and what might that mean for the significance of his theology generally. And then third, engagement. What difference does the Trinity make for life in the church and in society at large? So, Derrick, take it away in terms of the whole subject area of the three waves of Trinitarian theology.
Sure, yeah. So I did a lot of work for my master's thesis on the interface between systematic and historical theology, and Trinitarian theology in particular. And one of the things that I started noticing when I was reading a lot of this literature in the so-called the Trinitarian Renaissance of the 20th century is a lot of them incorporate these historical narratives into their overall systematic thought. Like they diagnose history in one way or the other, and they try to retrieve thinkers or move away from certain trends of thought accordingly. And this sort of spawned what is often termed the Trinitarian Renaissance. And so there's just an ocean of literature out there, as you know. And organizing that literature is very difficult. It's perhaps impossible, but it's always good to try and put things into categories. And when we're talking about three waves of Trinitarian theology, that's not necessarily something that any given thinker would identify with, you know, first wave, second wave, third wave. The term three waves actually comes from an article that Sarah Coakley wrote, and I thought it was a very helpful way to kind of initially start to organize things. And so, I think Karen Kilby is another, I believe she teaches at Nottingham, or she might be at Cambridge now. But anyway, she also uses the waves metaphor. And what Sarah Coakley meant by waves is she tried to look at the organizing principle that each of these the people in these respective waves, what were they trying to accomplish with Trinitarian theology? Obviously, all of these theologians believe the Trinity makes a huge difference to how we do theology, how we see everything. Robert Jensen's famous quote in his article on Karl Barth, you know, it's the Trinity isn't just a theological puzzle piece. It's the entire framework that allows us to see how all the other puzzle pieces fit. And in each of these waves, I think that is really a key aspect. The Trinity is something very fundamental. So that's not what's distinguishing them. In the first wave, as Coakley has it, and I think it's a model. Like all models, there are inadequacies, but it's helpful for teaching. She puts Karl Barth, Vladimir Lossky in the Eastern Orthodox, and so Karl Barth is kind of generally Reformed tradition, I suppose. We could say some of the Westminster folks might dispute that, but he is generally Reformed. And Karl Rahner, for the Catholics, is in the first wave. And what Coakley really identifies as first wave theology is there is a real felt need to move away from human epistemological categories controlling how the debate or how our pictures of God go. So Karl Barth, of course, famously is where he wants to emphasize God's otherness, the dialectic. God is reveals himself as Lord. So even in the act of receiving revelation, God remains Lord over that epistemol. We don't control that category. Science can't fundamentally distill God into test tubes, right?
God reveals God by God.
God reveals God by God, exactly. And so with Vladimir Lossky, similarly, though, obviously with key differences, he really wants to emphasize the apophatic and what he calls the antinomic dimensions of theology, to similar results. And just for the sake of summary and keeping this brief, Karl Rahner does several similar things, again with needed differences. And one of the ways that these three thinkers are united in the first wave category that Coakley says is they all kind of want to move away from person language for the Trinity. They're all a bit hesitant. Seinsweise is the alternate that modes of being. Karl Rahner, I can't remember exactly what he uses, but he uses something very similar, and Lossky himself is very hesitant. He wants to use this sort of, again, apophatic and kind of antinomic language. He's very hesitant about attributing personhood in the way that we understand human finite persons, right? And so this kind of goes to the first wave trajectory. They are very hesitant about our categories sort of boxing God in. In the second wave that Coakley wants to talk about, which is Colin Gunton, and actually really that whole class at King's College, John Zazoulis and others are often given that label, whether they would self-identify with that. They are much less hesitant per se about person language, and they, while appreciating, I think, some of the more, I guess, generally the apophatic or dialectical characteristics of the first wave, they are, at least as Coakley characterizes them, much more intent on seeing specifically how does the Trinity make a difference in Christian theology? How is a Christian theologian, because he believes in the Trinity, doing theology differently from, say, a Jew, or perhaps a Muslim, or a Buddhist, or an atheist? How does this affect the entire structure of systematic theology? And so they, while not necessarily abandoning apophaticism, are, I suppose we could say, a bit more on the cataphatic elements with respective differences.
So rather than what God is not like, what is God like? To put it in those terms.
Yeah.
Apophatic, what God is not. Cataphatic, what God is.
What God is, yeah. And these are kind of rough and ready distinctions. Obviously, there's across the board going to be nuances that need to come in, but this is how Coakley, I think, helpfully characterizes them. And just briefly for the third wave, what has begun to happen recently, and again, these labels aren't going to be taken on by thinkers who are given it. I had the opportunity to talk to Kendall Sulin, who I tend to see as a third waver. He takes a lot from the first two waves, but he said I don't take that at all. He's like he wasn't really resonating with it. So take that for what you will. But the third wave that Coakley identifies is that in the first wave, somewhat, and especially in the second wave, the emphasis on historical narratives of the evolution of Trinitarian thought through the centuries, what was good, what was bad, is really honed in as a sort of diagnostic device on the path to constructing a systematic theology of the Trinity. And the third waivers often are pretty suspicious of some of the historical narratives that are used. A lot of, I suppose we could call them tropes or heuristics or kind of shorthand stories get traded around that the third waivers have grown more and more suspicious about.
So they're apophatic on the first and second waves.
Yeah, they're apophatic on the second waivers' use of history.
The second,
yeah. And so as far as positive characteristics go, there are not a lot of positive characteristics uniting the third wave. I would say that they are more united in sort of negative suspicion of some of the histories that have often driven, I would say, mid-century up until early 2000s, narratives that kind of are driving a lot of systematic theology of the Trinity.
Yeah, it's kind of like neo-orthodoxy, and again, Bart always scoffed at that terminology, but those in his camp, like Gunton and Tillich and Bultmann and Brunner, as time went on, one realized that it was more what they were against that kind of connected them than what they were for. They all had different frames of reference, really, and I think what you're saying is it's not so much what they're for, but what they're against, what they're critiquing, that draws the third wavers together. Unlike Zulus, Gunton, Torrance, or the Torrances and such, they're really drawn together within that same framework. So that was first off the three waves, just to kind of give a structure. Then just very briefly, we mentioned the genetic problem. And I think this specifically relates to Colin Gunton, because I always scratch my head, okay, yeah, I get the criticism of Augustine regarding Gunton. I always felt that, with all due respect to the great man, the great theologian, his critique of Augustine wasn't a fair critique. But I also think it's not fair to then go from critiquing his critique of Augustine to say, well, then there's nothing there of merit. His constructive theological proposals have great merit, whether one agrees with them or not. They're robust, they're compelling as catalytic and provocative for further research. So if you want to speak to that, about some of the critiques of him related to the genetic, what we're calling the genetic problem.
So just, I guess, briefly, for those who are not familiar with the term, the genetic fallacy is attempting to debunk an argument or a person by showing their roots, what has ever come out of Nazareth, so to speak, So the genetic fallacy is attempting to show that something someone values actually has roots that show it isn't quite what it seems. I mean, every Christmas we get Christmas is actually, it has pagan origins. And I think the implicit premise there, if that's true, which it's not, but that's another video.
What? That's why I was always drawn to Christmas.
I know, sorry, Paul. But the genetic fallacy would therefore be saying that, Christmas is invalid because it, for some reason or another, it comes out of pagan roots and the Christians either co-opted it or just sort of wholesale adopted it. In terms of Trinitarian theology, people who are often, just for the sake of our presentation, in the second wave or identified as second wavers, Colin Gunton, T.F. Torrance, Robert Jensen, Eberhard Jungel, Wolfhard Pannenberg, a bunch of John Zazulus, Moltmann for sure, Jürgen Moltmann, just a huge array of names. Catherine Lacuna is probably a big one as well, and maybe Walter Casper. Anyway, often what happens is that the histories that their systematic theologies are either piggybacking on or are assuming as a matter of course in the constructive presentations, because because holes are being poked in it, therefore the assumption is that the entire systematic presentation collapses, right? And I don't think this is the case at all. And I say this against myself as well, because initially I really got into, Trinitarian theology was fascinating to me because, like a lot of second wavers really want to emphasize, or even first wavers, like Karl Rahner says, if we drop the Trinity as false, would our sermons and our theology fundamentally change? And in the late 19th and early 20th century, the answer to that was often, well, no, it wouldn't. It would just remain the same. We were all, I think he says, functionally monotheist in that sense. And so when Trinitarian theology, when I first got into it...
Functionally monotheist?
Functionally monotheist.
Not really, but functionally so.
Yeah, functionally so. And so when I first got into reading a bunch of this Trinitarian theology as an undergrad, it was really, really exciting stuff. Just because they were just showing how robustly the Trinity shapes everything. And I think a lot of people have really kind of gotten away from that because there was some historical infelicities, to put it nicely. And when I first stumbled across these historical infelicities, I became very enamored with that then too.
Yeah, because you're a historical theologian, really, in your impulses.
Yeah, and for me, a lot of it was, Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, Anselm, a lot of figures constructing something loosely called the West, which is sort of an abstraction, but that's what it is. When I was reading the primary sources, I didn't really identify a lot of the problems that these later thinkers say are here, or that they're at least incubating, and And so, I became very fascinated with what happened to cause these disconnects of reading, because there seems to be strategies of reading that are producing these caricatures of figures. But I think too often, people like myself who then stumble into this genealogy or this historical infelicity become too enamored with that. And again, just saying this against myself and broadly in the third wave, there is a tendency to not belittle Gunton, but perhaps just forget people like him who have just done immense historical work, or excuse me, immense systematic
constructive
theological work, and who, regardless of whether you agree with them or disagree with them, they are active and, so to speak, living conversation partners.
Yeah, and it's one of the things I always was fascinated with Barth is he always treated the theologians and philosophers before him as living dialogue partners. So Protestant theology in the 19th century by Barth is very much that. He sees them as living figures that he's still in dialogue with.
Yeah.
And I think with Gunton, it's unfortunate when someone passes from the scene, it's easy for people to say things that they might not necessarily have said when they're alive. And I think that can also be the case of how Gunton's generation may have, not that I think that would have been true of him, but what they may have as a generation done toward previous generations. It's we need to be charitable toward the dead because they are living voices and they do influence us. And Gunton having passed away many years ago, there is a concern that the constructive work for the ongoing conversation theologically would be maintained, while the criticisms, where they're appropriate, like I think going too far in Augustine or missing the thrust of what Augustine was, or the particulars. We can account for that without losing sight of what he was really about as a constructive theologian. And so New Wine, New Wineskins is almost 20 years into the making. Next year will be our 20th year. And it was shaped in many respects going back from the influences such as Karl Barth, Colin, Gunton, the robust Trinitarian thought forms, and others. John Perkins, more on the concrete social side of things, John M. Perkins, and a variety of others. But what I would like to say, just in closing on, so many of the New Wine reflections we'll be doing on a weekly basis reflect more of what difference does it make. And you mentioned, Ron or others saying, what difference would it make for our preaching? Newbegin said, Trinity Sunday, one would not know what to do with it. And that to me is most unfortunate. I think for Gunton and Barth before him, what really was at stake was not so much critiquing Augustine and others, though he did that. I think for many of them, Barth, Gunton, and others, it was more what was lost during the Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment period. And, Kevin Hector's important work is asking us, calling on us to rethink our interpretation of Schleiermacher. Still, to the extent that there are theologians, whether it's Schleiermacher or others, who have a latent form or a more substantial form of Sabellianism or modalism, again, whether it's Schleiermacher or not, that does make a difference negatively if you are more of a Sabellian or a modalist than if you are an Orthodox Trinitarian in terms of what it means for engaging the creation and culture at large. So, for example, Gunton in one of his works talks about, God enters into the soiled matter of creation, very much in an Irenaean vein, God's two hands, and he talks about Irenaeus. So he's trying to draw from the tradition.
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
And second century theologian Irenaeus, and Jensen once said to me, Gunton had three major influences in his life, in his thought life, in terms of theology, Barth, Gunton, and Irenaeus. And he says, Irenaeus increasingly so, Barth decreasingly so, and Jensen basically set aside to just a series of footnotes used over and over again, just quotes of Jensen used over and over again, and he was Gunton's mentor. But it was the idea there that with Irenaeus, that Gunton's drawing from the tradition and saying, God enters into the creation through his two hands, the Son and the Spirit. Instead of hovering over, God enters in. I mean, whether we're talking about witness like in evangelism or mission, to do drive-by evangelism, to do hovering over rather than engage people life on life, whether it's the creation and the environment, whether it's, what happens with a lack of creation care or gentrification or just kind of doing this kind of weekend plunge into the city and then leaving. That's more to me like God's not really in it, or we're not really in it. We're just kind of hovering about. It's kind of like a modalistic rendition, so to speak. And I think what Gunton was really after was taking seriously, what does it mean for the Father to work always in relationship to his Son and Spirit? Three persons, the one God. And to me, that's the type of riff New Wine is always trying to think through. And even Nicholas of Cusa, the great medieval theologian, who, as Miroslav Volf in his book on Allah and elsewhere, there's this important conversation with Nicholas that, God is love, and God can only be love if God is Trinitarian, because love always requires an object. I think it's Nicholas who makes this argument in the Discourse with Islam, that if God is not Trinitarian, God couldn't be love because love always requires an object. And if God does not have another within the divine life to love, then God will have to create the world in order to be love, which means that the world is then needed for God to be who God is, which is a denial of agape. So it's not just Gunton, it's Nicholas of Cusa dealing with Trinitarian implications. And that's in the medieval period. I think for me, that's what robust Trinitarian thought is about, whether patristics, medieval, modern, postmodern, to really take seriously what difference does the triune God make for the life of theology, the life of the church, the life of culture at large. This is Derrick Peterson, Louis Metzger, New Wine Tastings. Hope you enjoyed the time with us today. We surely enjoyed the time with you.